attending my presentation. Right. Sorry about that. Okay. So, incentive programs have been developed to encourage voluntary stewardship of endangered species on privately owned and managed lands. However, there is a lack of evidence regarding the effectiveness of such programs from the perspective of the landowner. I interviewed cattle ranchers participating in a national program, the SARPAL initiative, that supported voluntary stewardship initiatives to support the recovery of species at risk in Southwest Saskatchewan. Out of 23 ranchers interviewed, 21 identified as having ranched their entire lives. Their insights provide expert opinion on species at risk conservation on privately managed grasslands. The goal of our study was to consider the efficacy of a federally funded yet locally implemented program from the rancher's perspective, and to provide a set of recommendations that will inform regional, national, and federal government policy to support the development of the most relevant and needed incentive programs and other policies regarding agricultural production and species at risk conservation on the grasslands. So I'm going to concentrate on this presentation. We'll talk about the findings from the Saskatchewan research. But after I did that research for a year, I got another 2 years funding to expand that research into BC, Alberta, and Manitoba. So then I interviewed ranchers that were participating in programs like SARPAL or Multi-SAR, and I was introduced to relevant ranchers through the BC Cattlemen's Association, the Manitoba Beef Producers organizations like that. I interviewed 5 ranchers in Manitoba, 5 in Alberta, 4 in Saskatchewan, and I was supposed to interview 3 in BC that were identified, but I only was able to contact 2. The third one we were in contact with, but you know, ranching's a complicated situation and the timing just never worked out. So I was only able to interview 2 in BC. So what's interesting is that, as noted, I'm going to talk about the research I did in Saskatchewan because the findings actually were pretty much all across the board unanimous from all the different programs in all the different provinces, which was really interesting. The programs differed a bit in each province, and my later research was also a little bit different. When I interviewed BC, Alberta, and Manitoba ranchers, I kind of went into more about what they do to prevent drought and different, a few other issues like that. So it was a little bit different research, but I'll get to that a little bit later. So there were 6 program options in SARPAL, but due to time constraints, I'm not going to explain these options here, as I'd rather focus on the findings of the study. But further information can be found in the final report, which can be accessed at the link that's listed here. So the key findings were that, well, every rancher that we interviewed told us that they felt that being in SARPAL was beneficial to them. They greatly appreciated having the program managed and delivered by a local organization, which had ranchers staffing every level of the organization. So in Saskatchewan, that was SODCAP Incorporated, South of the Divide Conservation Action Program. So that's who delivered it. You'll hear a little bit more about SODCAP later on. So the ranchers said that they knew and trusted the ranchers that were running the program and felt that the delivery agents knew the challenges and realities of ranching in the region. The ranchers qualified for the program because they were managing the grasslands well and carefully. Many ranchers said that if SARPAL had influenced their behavior, it was in very subtle but important ways. So they didn't have to do any major changes to their grassland management, which was really important. We found that the incentives worked, but they were insufficient to encourage behavior change. As noted, the ranchers that qualified for SARPAL had already been managing their land very well for many years. So that's why they were a healthy habitat for conserving species at risk. But they felt that some of their peers who maybe are not managing as well would not be incentivized to change their management just for the amount of funding that was offered. So there was funding offered for meeting certain targets of your grassland management, but there was other incentives like some free fencing and some water improvement projects. But again, the ranchers said that this was really valuable. Of course, they'll take anything they can get. I mean, it's very helpful, especially if they don't have to make any huge changes to how they're managing their grasslands. But again, they said it just really isn't, it's just not enough. The ranchers really appreciated being recognized and rewarded for conservation and stewardship. And they said, as I noted earlier, they wouldn't be able to even qualify for the program if they weren't managing very well for many years. So they just appreciated that, they were doing that on their own initiative, just for the health of their business, basically, for keeping their grasslands healthy, to keep them solvent. So we came up with some recommendations. SODCAP Incorporated, which is the South of the Divide program that I mentioned, they were delivering the SARPAL program in Saskatchewan. So at the end of this research, I sent a report to them that they included in a larger report that they sent on to the funder, which was Environment and Climate Change Canada. So some of the recommendations we made were to provide longer term funding. So ranchers realize that short-term range management decisions may have long-term effects. So they may hesitate to sign up to short-term funding programs that might require changes to their range management that might be detrimental in the long run. And provide adequate funding. Many ranchers said that they would commit more of their land to the program if that option had been available. Ranchers suggested that they fund for the conservation of multiple species. So in Saskatchewan, there were certain species listed, swift fox, I know them all, Sprague's pipit, leopard frog, there was a bunch, but anyway, the ranchers suggested that depending on the weather, they have no control over the weather. So depending on the weather, different species will be moving in and out of their range. So they wanted it expanded to reward them for providing habitat for many more species. And target funding to specific regions, focusing on hotspots, as opposed to dispersing the funding equally across the nation. So this region in Southwest Saskatchewan is a really a hotspot for species at risk, and it also has a large tract of native grassland. Ranchers had many comments on the intricacies of species at risk conservation, noting it's a dynamic enterprise affected by various conditions such as climate habitat conditions and the policy decisions made in other areas where the species migrate, perhaps thousands of miles away. So they had a lot of insight into species at risk management. Another recommendation we suggested is to provide a local delivery agency for the stewardship program. This was a significant finding from our study. Participants in SARPAL knew and trusted the local ranchers that delivered the program in the region. They said many times, it's really a different situation if you just got somebody delivering the program in Ottawa or Toronto. They said, these people know what we're dealing with here. They know about ranching and they know the situation on the ground here. We also recommended designing the program to be synergistic with agricultural operations. Ranchers in the study appreciated the fact that the SODCAP Incorporated team visited their land and discussed the program terms with them. And as noted, they were ranchers themselves, so they knew the challenges. Funding land and production is a recommendation. Allotting large amounts of resources to taking land out of production in the grasslands has been proven ineffective. So a major case study on that was, while I was doing this research, I interviewed people that work at the Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan. And that's a really interesting case study because what they had done is the government had bought out all this ranching land from the ranchers to start up this Grasslands National Park, and they wouldn't allow any cattle grazing there. And their whole mandate was to provide healthy grasslands for species at risk habitat. So 20 years later, they found out that all the species at risk in the Grasslands National Park had left, and they were all living on the grazed grasslands surrounding them and owned by these ranchers. So they had to obviously backtrack, and they did some research, and they felt that actually they needed that grassland grazed to provide the best habitat. So they now are paying Saskatchewan cattle ranchers to graze their cattle in the park, and the species at risk are coming back. So that's an important point. And we recommend aligning policy among government agencies. ranchers expressed frustration that the nation is signaling that they value species at risk protection and that of their habitat, and yet the funding for these actions is often sporadic, short-term, and not aligned throughout the various levels of government. So we concluded that sensitive programs such as species at risk conservation on private agricultural lands are best served by the use of a local program delivery agent that actively involves the landowner in designing an individual program which fits his individual needs and circumstances, such as the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program delivery of SARPAL in southwestern Saskatchewan. We further contend that stewardship programs such as SARPAL, which have been widely accepted by the private land managers in our case study, need to be further funded and extended to achieve full potential and meaningful impact on species at risk conservation. Finally, there's a need to promote the integral role that ranchers play in protecting species at risk in their habitat. Such an educational campaign may generate further public support for funding national species at risk habitat conservation on grassland programs. Now, this is where the focus of my current research project has gone through. So mostly from talking to the Saskatchewan ranchers, they really pushed that the Canadian public needs to know about the good conservation and good management that they're providing for these grasslands and how important that is. So that's how I was able to access 2 more years of funding to expand this research to BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan as well. And my focus is now, I interviewed all those ranchers, those other provinces, including Saskatchewan, and I talked to them about their perception of the programs such as Multi-SAR and SARPAL, but I also talked to them about drought management and where they learned their range management and what they would like to sort of pass on to both the Canadian public, the Canadian government, and newer emerging ranchers. So some of these people were, 5th generation ranchers, 3rd generation ranchers, and they knew that it's hard for younger ranchers starting out to get that kind of information. So I actually got funded from Agriculture Canada to put those interviews together into a book that will be published in another year or so, and through UBC Press. And it's basically highlighting the interviews, basically what the ranchers had to say about good grassland management. So it's a little bit different than my first year, but my first year research in Saskatchewan, but it's all ties together quite well. And I think that's my time. So we'll open it up to questions.